Okay, there we go. All right, so hi everybody. My name is Kadar Hiremath. I am the program manager here at Ohio State for the Chronic Brain Injury Program. We're one of the groups that puts this on. If this is your first NeuroNights session, I'm just going to do a little bit of background for you. If you've been here before, I see already some familiar faces. Just bear with me for a second. My group, the Chronic Brain Injury Program, along with the Wexner Medical Center, in particular, the TBI rehabilitation program, and the folks at the outpatient clinics at Martha Morehouse have helped us to put this on. We also work really heavily with a student group called Buckeyes Raising Awareness in Neuroscience. One of their members is going to introduce our speaker tonight, and the students raise a lot of funds for this program as well through their 5K, which is coming up at the end of March. And so, all the proceeds go to help put this program on. So the way that we do this is every month we have a different theme. And so this is the first meeting of this month. And so we are going to be talking this February about lessons from veterans care. So we've got two speakers, one tonight and one next week. I definitely encourage you to come to both sessions because this is a model that we like to employ, where tonight we're going to talk about concepts. We're going to kind of get into the topic of what goes on in veterans TBI and what are the differences, and then kind of get into a little bit about some of the concepts around that. And then next week, we're going to talk about a little bit more about the actions people can take. If you are a military service member or a veteran, that is dealing with TBI or may have, some relationship to that, Kristen Benson is going to join us from the TBI Center of Excellence, which is part of the Defense Health Agency. And so she's going to talk a little bit about, some of the things that they're doing and a lot of the care that they're pioneering. And so we're really fortunate to have her as well. And she oversees the Ohio region. And so we're trying to connect her more with VSOs and other things here in the state. So that's kind of some of the background of what we're doing. I'm just going to give you all a quick look at. So over here, we've got just a couple things I want to go over. So the spring schedule, we've got a number of these set up all the way through June. So every month we've got enough activities going on. But starting in March, we're going to move to Wednesday nights. So that's we've always been on Thursday nights. We're going to move to Wednesdays, and this will help alleviate some conflict with another TBI support group. So this hopefully is a good thing. And then I talked a little bit about Kristen, so I'm going to move on there. In March, we also have the Ohio TBI Summit. If you've never heard of the Brain Injury Association of Ohio, it's the largest community and advocacy group in the state for survivors and professionals who work with brain injury. And so the idea this year is we're going to talk about research, education, and advocacy. And so some of the things that we do in these workshops with NeuroNights, which is focused on wellness, does bring in some of the research, is meant to educate on skills and things to do that can keep you well, but really also to kind of build that community and go after more advocacy goals. So definitely think about coming to that. If you're interested in that, we can share the website with you. I'll say it out loud here is biaoh.org/TBI Summit 2021. And we'll put that in some of the reminder emails. We also have a couple of research studies that are actively recruiting right now, so I just wanted to give them a shout out. We have one study right now that is on financial planning, specifically for people who have had brain injuries. These are free financial planning sessions with a private company that does financial planning just sort of for a broad audience, and we're trying to see what specifically could work for brain injury survivors or their family members. So if you're interested in that, let us know. Also, some of that will be in a follow-up email. And then we have another group that's recruiting for a study on physical activity after brain injury, specifically for people who have completed their physical therapy. And so this is another group. And so we'll send all that information out after tonight's session. And then the last bit is that we are going to have a speaker tonight. And so we asked some of the students if they would like to introduce our speaker. And we have a volunteer tonight, Nikhil Desai, who is a neuroscience major here at Ohio State. So he's going to tell you a little bit about himself, and then he's going to tell you a little bit about tonight's speaker, and then we'll just get into it. All right. So go ahead, Nikhil.
Yeah. Hello and welcome to NeuroNights. Just first, a little bit about myself. My name is Nikhil Desai. I'm a first-year neuroscience major. Just a little about neuroscience. I've always kind of been drawn to the field of neuroscience. It's very interesting to me. My sister was also epileptic, so it kind of made sense for me to go into that career path. Down the line now, I also do want to enlist into the Air Force and become a pararescue jumper. And then after that, I'm planning to go back to med school to become an anesthesiologist. But now to introduce Dr. Hayes, today we'll also be hearing from Dr. Hayes. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology here at Ohio State. She's also a faculty member of the Chronic Brain Injury Program and Sports Medicine Institute. Dr. Hayes is the director of the Mindset Lab, which focuses on chronic effects of brain injury, psychological stress on the brain, and health outcomes. Prior to OSU, Dr. Hayes was a PI at the National Center for PTSD and Boston University Medical School. She recently received the Early Career Investigator Award from the International Brain Injury Association. As a licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Hayes' interests include neuropsychological assessment of TBI and PTSD. Tonight, she'll be talking about some of the lessons learned from veterans with brain injury. So let us give a warm welcome to Dr. Hayes.
Thank you so much, Nikhil, and thank you so much all for coming onto this call. I'm honored to be here and talk about some of my work that I've conducted over the last several years. So I'm first going to share my screen so I can get my PowerPoint up and going. Okay, and so the talk title is Signature Injuries of War, Lessons from Veterans with Brain Injury. So before I get into my talk, I actually want to tell you a little bit about the how and the where I learned those lessons and just where I've worked with veterans over the last several years. So really my work in the VA system started as a PhD student. And so one of my faculty advisors was a neurologist at the VA in Tucson, Arizona. And it was really through him where I started seeing veterans who had brain injury through a wide variety of mechanisms, including motor vehicle accidents, health disorders that impacted certain parts of the brain, other types of acquired brain injury. And so that was where I really started to have a passion and dedication to understanding brain injury in this population. And so then I went on after my PhD, I went on to clinical training at the VA Boston. And so around that time, veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were just starting to come to the VA to be seen. But the majority of my patients were older veterans who were coming in and starting to have memory complaints, that sort of thing. And so we ran neuropsychological tests to see, can we differentiate different types of dementia? Or was it healthy aging? So what was kind of going on with these memory complaints in older adults? I immediately then went on to another VA. I did my postdoctoral training at the Durham VA and Duke Medical Center between 2006 and 2009. So this is when more veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars started coming to the VA. I also saw a lot of soldiers that would come up from Fort Bragg to be seen. And so this is kind of where I started working a lot in more of the younger veterans who are coming in and having the types of injuries that we think of as the signature injuries of the Iraq and Afghanistan war, which include post-traumatic stress disorder and mild traumatic brain injury. I then made it back to VA Boston. I must have loved it so much. I went back and I spent just under 10 years as a staff psychologist and researcher at the National Center for PTSD. And so I continued my work working with veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And so I did end up leaving the VA. I came in 2018. I'm now faculty at The Ohio State University, but I would really love to make connections with people here in the community, the Columbus VA, Cincinnati VA, other veterans and military personnel to kind of continue some of the work I had been doing over the last 12 years, both in terms of training and as a faculty member. So when I say signature injuries of war, what does that mean? So when the Iraq and Afghanistan wars started, a panel came together to look at the types of injuries that these veterans or military personnel were having. And so there were 4 injuries that were identified that were really common injuries in these military personnel. And that included severe burns and amputations. The thing about these injuries is that they are very difficult injuries to treat, but they are also visible. So when you have this kind of injury, as a soldier, you get treatment right away. That injury is identified, it's visible, you get the treatment, you might need to be airlifted, and you get rest, and you get the kinds of services that you need because these injuries are on the surface and they're able to be seen. Now, there were 2 additional injuries that were identified in this report that were common injuries, and they're what we call more invisible injuries. And those include post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. So a lot of times when military personnel went through a very traumatic time during their deployment, or they were exposed to a blast or another type of head injury, a lot of times, unless it was very severe head injury, there was no recognition that it was an injury. So soldiers didn't get a chance to stop and get treatment. They would typically be sent back on missions later that day or the next day. There was no kind of time to rest or think about what happened. So a lot of the outcomes that we see are kind of more long-term outcomes, and so they're more invisible. You can't identify that someone has PTSD just kind of walking around. And so that made it particularly difficult to try and assess and treat individuals who are coming back stateside and having lots of symptoms, trying to figure out what was going on with them. So when I started looking into this issue of PTSD and traumatic brain injury and the kinds of injuries that veterans were having, a lot of it came from this type of blast injury. So as you probably have heard, a lot of the veterans were exposed to IEDs or improvised explosive devices or rocket propelled grenades. There were just a lot of explosive ordnance that they were exposed to. And so here's kind of a typical depiction of what that blast would look like. So a blast, there was an explosion. There are different kinds of mechanisms that could impact the body. One is primary blast mechanisms, or the actual blast wave that would hit the soldier. The other are secondary blast mechanisms. So if there were pieces of shrapnel that came off of the explosive ordnance, they could potentially also impact the soldier's head and body. And then there were tertiary blast mechanisms, which might be caused from the soldier being thrown back against something. And so their head hits something. If they're in a Humvee, for example, their head hits the ceiling or the floor of the Humvee. And so they sustain a head injury that way. So in terms of blast mechanisms, around the time that I started studying this question, and this was, I'd say, 2006, there really was very little known about how blast impacts the brain. So there was a very prominent paper that was out there that said blast mechanisms don't impact the brain because you have this really thick skull. And so the skull essentially stops the blast wave from penetrating the brain. So they acknowledged that there were some areas of the body that do get impacted by primary blasts, and that includes the lungs and the eardrums or air-filled, fluid-filled cavities of the body. But when it comes to the brain, it just really is not impacted by a blast. And so this question, it just really resonated with me because I was seeing soldiers that were exposed to multiple blasts having a range of symptoms. And so I asked the question, is it really true? Is it really the case that blast does not impact the brain? And so I wanted to learn about how these injuries, blast mechanisms, blast TBI and PTSD impact the brain. And I started looking to neuroimaging techniques to study these questions. So around that time, I was a clinician in the neuropsychology clinic at the Durham VA, again, between 2006 and 2009. And I met a soldier who, a veteran who came into the neuropsychology clinic complaining of difficulties with memory, attention, hearing, and balance, who I will call Sergeant N. So just working with Sergeant N really opened my eyes to this question of how blast might impact the brain and body. And so through working with Sergeant N, I learned that he had been exposed to multiple blast injuries during his work in the Explosive Ordnance Disposal Service. And so it's essentially his job to go out there in the field, identify and dispose of any munitions that had not exploded at that time. He was also involved in dynamic entry operations, in which he would try and place explosives strategically in a doorway that was otherwise locked in order to gain entry into that doorway. And so between his missions and all of the trainings that he did, he was exposed to multiple blasts. And so he reported probably around 50 blasts in which he felt headaches and other types of symptoms following that blast. And so we ran a we did neuropsychological tests with Sergeant N. And what was really striking about him was that he was particularly impaired in the set of cognitive functions that we call executive functions, which essentially are your ability to plan and make decisions, and just kind of have these higher complex routines that you can where you can accomplish your goals. So this was particularly concerning for someone like Sergeant N because of the type of job he had really depended on executive functions. So to be able to find, identify munitions and dismantle them under time pressure takes a lot of skills in terms of planning, in terms of working memory, in terms of decision making, what to do at that time to try and protect you as well as your fellow soldiers. So the fact that he was having these difficulties at age 55 when he was so developed in his career was very concerning to us. Sergeant N actually allowed us to scan his brain. And so at that time, diffusion tensor imaging was a technique that had just started to be used, but was not used to the same degree as it is today. So we were able to scan his brain and look at the white matter, where we think traumatic brain injury is particularly damaging. What we found when we compared his brain to matched controls is widespread abnormalities in the white matter. So wherever you can see kind of this orange, red, and yellow areas is where Sergeant N was particularly different, where we had abnormalities in white matter in comparison to other people who had not been exposed to these blast injuries. And so that started telling us a little bit about a potential story about how blast mechanisms may impact the brain. So of course, Sergeant N, as much as we learned from his brain, he is one case. And so I wanted to develop my study into a greater number of soldiers who had been exposed to blast. And so we conducted additional studies. And so here what I'm showing is a diffusion tensor imaging map that actually outlines the strategy that we use, the methodology that we use. So we can actually measure the flow of water throughout the white matter in the brain. And we can also do things like measure tracts in the brain. And so here what I'm showing is tracts that we looked at, white matter tracts in Sergeant N, that again had abnormalities in comparison to controls, matched controls. So we used these methods to see how blast injury might impact Sergeant N's brain. So like I mentioned, we wanted to look at a greater number of individuals to see if it was a consistent story. And so in this study, we looked at about 100 Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans who had been exposed to blasts. Some of them had and some of them hadn't. Some of them had lost consciousness following their blast, and that's what I'm saying here is LOC, lost consciousness. And the same story kind of emerged, that throughout the brain, we're seeing changes in the white matter. And so here I'm showing the red is just kind of our template, the areas that we looked at. So in controls, we're not really seeing a lot of damage. In our individuals who had blast but did not have a loss of consciousness, we're seeing a few more regions in the brain that are altered. But in our individuals who had blast plus lost consciousness, we're seeing widespread areas of abnormalities in the brain. So we now have run multiple studies. Here's an example of another study showing a slightly different technique that we used, again with diffusion tensor imaging, showing widespread abnormalities in individuals who have post-concussion syndrome secondary to blast mechanisms. And so what we think is happening, even in these mild kinds of blasts that we think, we're not talking about moderate, severe head injury, we're talking about mild. What we think is happening is due to the rotation of some forces in the blast. We think that if you look at a healthy white matter fiber bundle in your brain, you can see it, the structure is very tight. When you start to add some forces to that white matter fiber bundle, you're going to see that some of the molecules, the structure gets shifted around, and the molecules can't really travel up and down the fiber like they're used to. So they start to clump together. And eventually, and then if you look at it through a microscope, you can see these kind of elongated sort of balloons that form. And eventually these balloons separate and that cell dies. The connection between cells die. So as opposed to moderate and severe head injury, we don't see this throughout the entire brain. In moderate and severe, you do see it much more in a severe way. However, our work demonstrated that even with mild injury, with blast, we are seeing potentially these changes in the brain. And so to us, that really answered the question and refuted the work at that time suggesting that blast does not penetrate the brain. Here's just a cartoon from one of our papers, just kind of showing that disruption that might occur following a head injury. So I just want to encapture kind of over, the last several years, what we learned from doing neuroimaging work in traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. So what we found is that white matter disruptions in blast are spread out throughout the brain. So they're not necessarily localized. So if you have a blast injury, maybe it was directly in front of you, it's not that the blast is going to impact right here in the frontal lobes. It seems like the injury is diffusely spread out throughout the brain. And that really supports, so our imaging work supports postmortem work. So we're able to look at this in live individuals. A lot of some of the other work has been done in postmortem showing these distributed areas of abnormalities. Another thing that we learned was that loss of consciousness seems to be a particularly important marker of that blast-related severity. So we see a whole range of severities, even in that mild kind of category. So we can see subconcussive blasts where people were a little bit further away from the blast, yet they still have some symptoms. We see people who are close to the blast, some people who are so close that it actually induces a loss of consciousness. And so our work really does show that the more sort of close you are to the blast, the more severe it is in terms of loss of consciousness, seems to show those structural changes in the brain. We also showed through one of 2 or 3 of our different studies that white matter disruption, or those brain abnormalities that we're seeing, are indeed what seem to be underlying symptoms that we're seeing, such as memory problems and executive function problems that we're seeing. And then one of the questions that we tried to answer, again, in the beginning, I talked about how TBI is not only a signature injury, but so is post-traumatic stress disorder, and their symptoms overlap. So in both kinds of disorders, you have individuals who are reporting things like concentration difficulties, they're having memory difficulties, they're having irritability and headaches. So when a soldier comes to us and has had a traumatic event, as well as a blast-related mild traumatic brain injury, how is it that we can treat this individual? Can we send them for PTSD treatment, or will the brain injury impact how they do in PTSD treatment? These questions were really something that we struggled with when a lot of the military personnel were coming back. And so what some of the brain research work, the imaging work that we showed, was that although there are these overlapping symptoms between PTSD and mild TBI, there seems to be different underlying brain mechanisms. So with TBI, we're really seeing it in the white matter disruption that I showed with our diffusion tensor imaging work. With PTSD, because you don't have those mechanical forces hitting the brain, we really don't see that kind of shearing and twisting of fiber bundles. We see more functional deficits in terms of fMRI changes. We also see more changes in gray matter and gray matter volume than we do with the white matter. So in a sense, we were able to almost differentiate in the brain these different types of disorders. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes and then I'll stop talking and we can have more of a discussion about some of our newer work and the directions that we're going in. So, you know, a lot of the work that I talked about was looking within a short period of time following a brain injury or a psychological trauma. So a lot of times our veterans were, you know, they might have sustained their injury 3 years ago. It might have been 6 months ago, all the way to maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Now, what about our veterans who are aging and they're living with these injuries into older age, into their 60s, 70s, 80s? Even if they didn't, one of the questions I wanted to answer is, even if they didn't have major symptoms at the time of their injury, is it possible that some symptoms will emerge once aging takes hold of the brain and we're less able to you know, have some plasticity to counterbalance some of the deficits that we have that ability to when we're younger? And so one of the questions is, you know, does TBI put you at risk for neurodegeneration at a later time? So does TBI, for example, put you at risk for something like Alzheimer's disease? And so the literature is somewhat mixed at this stage, but there's more and more evidence suggesting that indeed TBI of different types of severity are associated with greater rates of dementia. So this is just a picture from not one of my studies, but a colleague's work, who looked at medical records in veterans and found that those who had reported or had something in their medical chart suggesting that they had a TBI developed dementia at higher rates than individuals who did not have a TBI. And so that just kind of started another direction of my work, in which we're asking some of these questions, and particularly in the Mindset Lab now at OSU. So what are the long-term effects of concussive hits or blasts on the brain and cognition? And how does that compare to stress from psychological trauma? So we know from some of the work that I did at the National Center for PTSD that when you have psychological trauma, that can also translate to brain changes, and it can translate to greater biological markers of neurodegeneration, such as greater oxidative stress and inflammation. So we know that there's shared mechanisms there, but are they completely shared? Are there different pathways that might lead to aging or accelerated aging or dementia if you have TBI versus PTSD? And another thing is, you know, with dementia or Alzheimer's disease, memory is one of the first things, the cardinal signs that you lose memory, episodic memory. Memory is also the seat of PTSD as a disorder, just these intrusive memories or not being able to forget. But both disorders impact the hippocampus, a really important area of our brain that is important for creating new memories. So some of the questions we also want to ask are, what are the processes by which traumatic memories are persistent and uncontrollable, and how might that relate to dementia through the aging process? And then finally, what biological factors make someone vulnerable to neurodegenerative disease following concussion and psychological trauma? So the factors that we're looking at are not only brain imaging factors, but blood markers. So can we look at inflammatory markers, for example, or blood-based tau markers or A beta markers that occur following traumatic brain injury that might then be a way to identify who is going to develop Alzheimer's disease. We're also looking at genetic markers and epigenetic markers that might tell us on an individual level what kind of profile a certain person has and their mix of genetics and environmental factors that they have had in their life that might put them at risk for negative outcomes as they age. So now, in order to answer some of these questions, we are doing longitudinal assessment of TBI, traumatic stress, and Alzheimer's disease and accelerated aging. And so my lab has two main projects going on now that that we have to answer these questions. The first one is an NIH-funded project. So the National Institutes of Aging has provided funding for us to look at all those markers that I just mentioned, the genetics, epigenetics, and blood-based biomarkers in those veterans that I have been studying over the last several years. So we're following those same veterans over time to see how they age and whether or not the blast injuries that they sustained or the PTSD symptoms that they have are impacting their trajectory of changing over time. So that study is ongoing. Now, we're also starting up a new study, and this is in collaboration with another lab, the Buckeye Brain Aging Lab, as well as the Chronic Brain Injury Initiative. And so we're developing this data repository in which we're going to start recruiting very shortly. And so our target here really is to look at different mechanisms of brain injury. So we are going to try and recruit individuals who have had sports concussion mechanisms, as well as veterans having a mix of blast as well as blunt-related head injury, as well as delving into a little bit of how domestic violence survivors and the interface between psychological trauma that happens during domestic violence and potential head injury that happens during those events, how those interact to predict treatment response as well as aging in the future. And so with this project, we're really interested in making connections with the community and recruiting individuals who are interested in contributing their time to this project. So I'm going to end here and I'll stop share my screen. But I would love to field any comments or questions that you have about any of the work that I've presented.
So you're welcome to just unmute and ask a question. There's also the chat feature if you prefer that, but definitely feel free to ask questions.
Memory for me would be definitely a huge thing I'm looking at now. I'm a patient, not a not a professor, or but I can tell my memory's not right, and other things aren't right, and my functioning. It's weird. It's hard to describe, but
absolutely, memory is one of the things that people are really concerned about it, and they're concerned about it early. One of the concerns is, the kinds of memory problems that I'm having, is it related to the healthy aging process? So we know that with aging, our brain is less plastic. We're just less able to handle a lot of information and encode a lot of information. So is what is happening to me in my memory now, is it something that I should be concerned about? Is it related to dementia, or is it related to the healthy aging process? And I know that for so many people that question comes up, and it's
right. Yes, I would. The healthy aging is another. You wonder.
absolutely. And so just, just a really quick rule of thumb that I sometimes use to identify if people should go out and get see their healthcare provider and get a neuropsychological assessment. And that's actually one of the best ways to see, okay, is this memory issues that you're having? Is it something to be concerned about? And are there things that you can do now to support your memory? Or is it something that, everybody has at this stage in their lives? So just kind of some, rule of thumb sorts of things is, those kinds of things where we forget people's names. It's on the tip of your tongue, someone, but you just can't recall for your life. You can't recall names, and you
My
can't.
mother gets it backwards every time. She calls me Colin, my brother, and my brother Perry. We don't bother her. We just let her do it.
Exactly, right. That's the kind of thing that, for a lot, again, this is just a broad strokes. For a lot of people, that is actually a very normal thing that's happening. A lot of people have
Right.
that. I tell you, I think starting in your 40s, late 30s, it's something that people struggle with. It's really when you completely forget someone's name and you don't recognize it when someone tells you. It's someone that you should know because it's a family member, someone that you see regularly, and there's no recognition for it. At that point, it's something to be concerned about. Another example is where you parked your car. If that you parked your car somewhere and you just can't, a general area, but you just can't find it, that unfortunately is still pretty common. That happens. If you forget that your mode of transportation, how you got there, that you drove in a car, that's time to worry, to be concerned. Again, these are really broad strokes, but it's just one way to figure out, if you have a normal concern versus something that's probably more pathological. But I would say that trying to get a neuropsych test evaluation is definitely one way to put your mind at ease if you are having issues with your memory.
Jasmeet, just on.
Yes, been out when I was driving years ago. That would help find it if you were lost.
Absolutely. And that's another thing that I see as an advantage of getting a neuropsychological assessment is that a lot of times you get recommendations on what you can do to support your memory. So there are, so many memory aids that people can rely on to try and help them get through their day. And so those are strategies that a neuropsychologist can help develop.
Jasmine, I just want to jump in here and ask a quick question. We have tools like the SAGE test, that kind of give you a quick answer on, is this normal? Is this abnormal? Is this something to check into? And that's something that you can have any physician do for you. Do you recommend those kinds of things? Do you think it's just easier to go and try and get to a neuropsych instead?
Yeah, I think if you have kind of a passing concern and you think that it's a concern, but it's nothing that people have told to you, it's not something that people have said, okay, your memory is really bad. And I think those kind of doing a self-assessment or having a quick sort of screen is definitely fine. I think that will help put your mind at ease. I do think, though, to get a really good answer, and even at this stage, neuropsychologists can actually help identify whether or not it's something like Alzheimer's disease versus something like a cerebrovascular dementia. So kind of if there are problems, honing in on what seems to be the etiology of those issues can be helpful that a screen, quick screen won't be able to do.
Okay. I do have one question that comes from Emily Brown. So she says, Dr. Hayes, thank you for this information. It's much appreciated. are you able to provide more information or resources that she could look into regarding the risks of dementia following TBI? So, what are things that we can look into? And then a follow-up here is, does there seem to be one type of dementia, maybe frontotemporal or versus Alzheimer's? Is there kind of a trajectory that we can see?
Yeah. So I want to make a plug first for, so I feel like it's, it's responsible for me to kind of put all of this research in context. And I think that a lot of times when we see these links between TBI and really bad outcomes like dementia, I think that ratchets up the anxiety, because I think for most of us, we have had at least one or multiple concussions. A lot of us have mental health diagnoses like depression, PTSD, those kinds of things. And I think the natural response is, oh my God, am I going to get dementia because I had a TBI while playing a sport or something like that? So I do want to put these results in context and say that overall, the kinds of symptoms that we're seeing, they tend to be fairly mild. So our veterans, the subjects who have come in, they are able to function. They do get treatment, whether it be, psychiatry, psychology, or a combination of both, and they benefit greatly from the treatment. So people like Sergeant N are more on the rare spectrum, where we're seeing really more severe deficits. So overall, if you've had a sports concussion or you've had loss of consciousness, you are, for the most part, going to be okay. That's what our research shows. It's really when you start to have multiple injuries in short period of time, and I think that's where Sergeant N's injury came in, where on a daily basis, multiple times a day, he was being exposed to this blast. If you have sports injuries, and the big thing is now, should people rest? Should they be pulled out of the game? Absolutely, because the studies are showing that the closer you have these impacts, probably the worse you're going to be. So overall, you had a few TBIs, concussions throughout your life. For the most part, you are going to be okay. And those studies showing links between TBI and neurodegenerative disease, they're more on the research side of things right now. So there's nothing that's been developed at this stage that says you have a TBI, you might develop dementia. So here are, tips and tools that you can use to try and prevent that. So it's all really in the research realm. If you're interested in the research, I can send around papers that actually studied veterans as well as other individual sports, people with sports concussion who have followed them over time. Now, in terms of the question of specific type of dementia, so you may have heard about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. That was in the news a lot because of the NFL. And so that seems to be this new sort of dementia that people have identified that seems to be related to repetitive hits to the head that you would see in something like football. So we are seeing CTE in some individuals. When we're talking about those individuals, we're talking about professional football players who are getting hit at really high speeds with people, someone who's 300 pounds is pummeling you to the ground. We're not seeing, you fall and you hit your head. It's kind of a different story with NFL players versus the kinds of concussions that we see in daily life. So, it's in certain populations, it does seem to be more of a CTE type pathology. In other populations, it is more of an Alzheimer's type of disease. So what we're trying to do is identify who is at risk for these different subtypes. And I don't think that we just don't have an answer for that at this stage. All we know is that repetitive hits something that happens in the NFL might actually put you more at risk for CTE, and just kind of general other types of CTE, TBI might be more related to Alzheimer's. But those are all really great questions that are open right now. We just don't know the answers to.
All right, thanks. Does anybody else have a question? If not, I have a bank of them, as I always do.
I just wanted to add really quickly that the military is also looking at CTE. It's not something that we've made super public just yet, but we are looking in certain populations. So for example, the Navy Special Boatmen, or SWIC as they're called. So these are people who are on these very, very small boats being transported, right? And they're in extremely choppy water. So this is one population. We're also looking at instructors who work with heavy weapons like shoulder-mounted assault weapons, for example, people who are combat engineers who are pretty consistently exposed to sort of low-level blast. We're also looking at airborne and also like MCMAP instructors for things like that. So I think it's really interesting that you brought that up.
And so everybody, that was Kristen.
Hi, by the way, so sorry.
That's all right. She's our speaker next week, so there was your little preview. So Laura just asked here.
Something to that, Kate,
Okay.
as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning that, Kristen. One of the studies that we have shown, and I think this is again along the lines of the typical type of injury that we see with blast, and that is, we're studying mild related blast injury. One of the kind of outcomes that we also see is that people who have multiple risk factors are the ones that are showing some more degeneration. So, if you have a single TBI, or you have multiple TBIs spread out over time, it's really those individuals who might also have a genetic predisposition for developing Alzheimer's disease. You take two risk factors together, and that puts you at greater risk. And so part of the research is really breaking down, if you have this risk factor, so you have genetic risk, and you have psychological trauma, and you have a mild TBI, are those the combination, if you will, to kind of put your body over the threshold to start developing neurodegenerative disease? So really what our research is showing, that it's not just a single factor, it's really the combination of multiple factors. And I think that that should also put us at some ease that you need kind of this special sort of formula to really push your body down this road of neurodegeneration.
Thank you. That's a good point. Laura had asked here in the chat, do we know anything that could help the damaged white matter heal or not get worse? And even if it's not related to just brain injury, but in general, are there things that can help white matter recover and stay resilient, I suppose, is one way to think about it.
That's a great question, and it's a topic of some really hot research. So, our body generally has repair mechanisms anyway. So, after head injury, let's say, your body goes through a period of recovery. So there's special molecules and proteins that start to grow back those degenerated axons or the white matter. And so your body has this natural recovery mechanism. And that's also why if you get another head injury that disrupts that recovery process in that short amount of time, you're just unable to recover later. So it's really crucial to let your body go through that recovery process. And I think that's, one reason why we do want to pull people out of sports or pull them out of a situation in which they can get re-injured in that period of time, that critical period of time. So there's natural healing processes. We're studying a molecule called BDNF that's really important for regeneration and synaptic plasticity. So I would guess that people are really trying to look at how to generate medications that can boost some of these molecules that are important for that natural recovery of axonal damage. I actually don't know of any successful treatments at this time. And I don't know, Kristen, if you know of any either. But in terms of at the molecular level, I think people are trying to study what can actually do that, but we just don't know at this stage.
That's certainly the subject of some of the research that we're doing here at Ohio State, and certainly something that's not actually an uncommon thing to be exploring right now. So that was a really good question, actually. I really like that. Um, so one of the things that you said, Jasmeet, early on, is that your work really helped refute the understanding, that blast injury wasn't really penetrating, right? And you're showing that it kind of does work in the same ways that blunt force can. It's got its own things, but certainly has at least that component. And it's good when we find this information out and we start correcting the story, or we get more accurate with the story that we tell about what goes on with brain injury. But what do you think might be like the lasting impact of the previous way of thinking? Do you think that those myths are still out there? Are there things that we can do to, try and figure out what was true 5 years ago and what's true today? How do we go about that?
Well, what's interesting is I had a lot of conversations with Sergeant N. I just really learned a lot from him. And he was also in this instructor role. So he was in the middle of a lot of it. And what he would say is that, they actually do have helmets with pressure gauges during training, and, during the different missions that they do. And so they're told to stay under a certain pressure during training. And he would say, well, for the most part, we just ignored it. Part of it was bravado. I'm the instructor here. I'm the tough guy. I need to go and get the job done. It doesn't matter what I'm exposed to. I'm going to go in there and do it. That's my mission. That's my role. So I think that there was some understanding that some at a certain level, and I think the level was way too high. It should have been lowered, what is considered dangerous. But, even if they sort of took that into account, it was, just this phase of just this belief that you have to go in and do the mission no matter what. And so in that sense, I'm not sure that some of the research that we're showing would prevent what we're talking about. I mean, one of the great things that is happening now versus when Sergeant N was in the field is robotics. So when Sergeant N was in the field, robots were doing very little of the work, and now they're actually doing a majority of the work. So send a robot in there to find that unexploded ordnance and go ahead and explode it, and then none of the live soldiers will be in the area when that happens. So in some, so times have changed, and I think that some of the soldiers are less vulnerable to being in that same situation that Sergeant N was in. I think another thing that has changed is because we know that blast injuries could impact the brain, that soldiers were reporting to be able to be taken out more from the next mission. So I've heard reports that, it did filter down, that people were taken out of active duty and given some rest if they were exposed to a blast. So there's greater assessment and greater recognition that there could be these long-term outcomes. So I think that there has been a shift, because of these different reasons, but you have that soldier that's going to go out there and do their job, and they're going to be exposed to these things. And we need to figure out how to best take care of them when they do that.
Oh, thanks. I mean, it's great to hear that at least the work has had that kind of impact, and we've done some change. Is there?
Sorry, I think that was really beautifully put, Dr. Hayes, and I wanted to kind of add on to that. So you are in fact absolutely correct. We do have a policy now that basically states to all line leaders that if someone is exposed to a blast, or if they've been exposed to a concussive event, that they are absolutely required to have at least 24 hours of rest, and that everyone is required to have a TBI screening following that. So at least we're making that much kind of movement and gaining that much traction. We still have a long way to go, and I think I like to tell when I'm speaking with civilians particularly, I like to really emphasize like the importance of having civilian research also, because there is this really wonderful lack of normalization of trauma, right? The military has this way of saying, okay, no matter what you're going through, that's not trauma, it's Tuesday. And we keep pressing forward, we adjust fire, and we carry on, right? And civilians are like, wait. That can't be right. So they're not as I guess desensitized to it. And so the research really is so super important. And to kind of circle back to policy, I think now that we're moving kind of in garrison, some of the climate is going to change, and in garrison just means that we're not necessarily at war. In garrison means that we're kind of more CONUS, right? We're more at home. So the climate will change. The climate's going to change a little bit in terms of what are the needs, right, of military members and veterans. So if you're looking at a cohort coming from 2012 on, we've kind of missed a lot of, OIF, so Iraq, and then of course Afghanistan. We missed a lot of those deployments. So it's a much different cohort of people. However, we're still looking at like instructors. We're still looking at special forces. We're still looking at airborne. We're still looking at SWIC, EOD. And in those cases, when we're talking about something as bureaucratic as the military, we have to look at policy, right? And we have to look also at what is fiscally responsible. And so perhaps what policy looks like when we're presenting numbers of research where it cannot be disputed, where it's objective, right? These are hard objective numbers that they can't be argued with. We make policy changes to say, for example, someone cannot be billeted, which is have orders to or have that job as an instructor for longer than X amount of time. Because we know now that, if they're exposed for more than this amount of time, then we might see physiological changes that are either irreparable or going to be profound in their activities of daily living.
Absolutely.
That's all, sorry.
No, that's great, and I think that's kind of a good way to start thinking about what we're going to be doing next week. So Kristen's going to talk a little bit about, not just the practices in the military from managing and preventing injury, but also how they're approaching care systems as well. She's tons and tons of resources that she can provide for us, and she sent a bunch of those over today. So a lot of good information out of that one. I have one last question here. Well, I have two, and so one is for Jasmeet, and then one's for Kristen, if that's all right.
Sure.
So for Jasmeet, what Kristen said, there's an interesting difference between the civilian population and the military populations, and certainly the way that they might approach trauma is one thing, but I had a conversation just an hour before we started. And the person said, brain injuries are like a fingerprint. Everybody, you might have one, but they're all very different. And I'm just curious if there's, are there like general rules about brain injury in the military population versus brain injury in the civilian population? Are there these massive differences? Are there, way more commonalities? How do we view that? And should we be thinking about them as two different groups or maybe one big group?
Yeah, that is a fascinating question and something that I am actively studying. What I can say is we do see some differences in what I call blast mechanisms versus more blunt, which happens in sports where you actually do get a knock on the head. So with blast mechanisms, we think that it is more diffusely spread out in the brain. Whereas when you get a blunt trauma, you get a blunt head injury, you get hit right there, it's likely that you're going to get something over here, and then your brain kind of slushes back and you might get something on the opposite side. So there is possibly more focal injury, as well as the diffuse injury with blunt trauma. Whereas with blast, we're really not seeing more of that focal injury. We're seeing it more spread out throughout the brain. And so in that way, I think it is difficult to find overlap between different people who have different injuries. So you have veteran A who had a blast, might have completely different disruptions in white matter than veteran B who had a blast. There are some commonalities in this region that we call the corpus callosum, which is a huge white matter bundle in the middle of our brain and connects our two hemispheres. It's the largest white matter bundle, so you can't really get a knock to the brain without that being impacted. So that seems to be a shared region that between both of the injuries. But one of the research studies that we're actually looking at now is a potential difference in mechanism of the blast and how that might impact your metabolic system versus just because of the blast wave versus something like a knock to the head where you don't have this blast that's going through your body. And so our latest research is showing that a blast is more related to metabolic disorder, which includes high blood pressure, obesity, changes in blood cell count. So just different things in your body change due to that metabolic disorder. And when you have this blast TBI and metabolics, you end up having higher inflammation, which is related to neurodegeneration. So we don't see that relationship. So we compared veterans who had blast only versus those who had blunt only, like knock to the head. And so we're only seeing the metabolic changes in the blast veterans as opposed to the blunt head injured veterans. But that's, so that is new work that definitely needs to be replicated before we have, I say for sure that this is what's going on in blast. But we're, that work's underway, and that's also part of why in our FASTER study, we want to get both sports concussion, which is a different mechanism, as well as blast to try and look at those similarities and differences.
And that's interesting that you're making the point that it's not veterans versus civilians. It's actually blast versus blunt force. And
Yeah. So our work is showing, more. So there are differences in, people of who ends up going into the military and versus civilians. So there are many differences among those two populations. But when it comes down to mechanisms, you can have sports concussion as a veteran. There's lots of, they play sports while they're deployed and, at the base. So you can have any of those kinds of injuries. What's really unique is that blast mechanism.
okay, if you have a question, we still have a couple minutes. But I'm gonna ask one while you're thinking about it. So Kristen, we talked a little bit about sort of the concepts here, and so I guess to me it says okay, you could be at risk for neurodegeneration. We know that there are some warning signs or some things like that, and we don't necessarily know exactly the tools or the approaches for each person that can help them stay brain healthy for as long as possible. We've got some ideas, but there's no uh, silver bullet or there's no one size fits all approach. And what happens after brain injury might not just be your health, right? It might not just be your memory. It might be other things. So the question is, what might be challenges and maybe the accompanying solutions for veterans or even active duty service members that are related to having a brain injury. So things like going to school, finding work, being with family as they come home. Can we get into like maybe a couple minutes on that? And I know we'll do that in the next session as well.
Sure, of course. So from a social work lens, of course, I always try to evaluate things from the biopsychosocial and spiritual and cultural model. And so I see things as this very complex network of very interacting forces, versus something that's more linear. And so when we're talking about people who have incurred a brain injury, the way that I like to look at it is, one of the things I think I notice probably the most is what can overlap with behavioral health and mental health issues. And so when we're looking at that intersectionality, it's very clear that veterans often either erroneously or correctly are often diagnosed with, anxiety, depression, PTSD, sometimes adjustment disorders. And while these may very well be true, oftentimes when we have a TBI and it is going undiagnosed for a variety of reasons, these can be presenting very much as a behavioral health or a mental health issue. In fact, perhaps it isn't. And so this can lead then to issues with their chain of command. It can lead to issues in terms of them promoting, for example, which is then of course going to result in socioeconomic issues. Maybe they're not making as much money. They're having issues with their family, and all of these things start to interact with one another to stress this person out, to make them more susceptible to other mental health issues, to make them more susceptible or rather less likely to want to have buy-in on treatment if they do have PTSD or something like that. It interrupts their sleep. Of course, they're having disruptions in sleep now, and of course, they get diagnosed with insomnia. And then once they make it all the way to the VA, they've got this whole host of problems. They've got this huge problem with this really complicated symptom profile when it could be that there's been an undiagnosed traumatic brain injury in the past, right? And it's sort of catalyzing all of these other things, or it's exacerbating all of these other things. The whole thing is extremely interactive, right? And I think another thing is sometimes can look at like what we call a pattern of misconduct, right? So some of that impulsivity, the emotional dysregulation, sometimes forgetfulness, or even fatigue, right? Maybe it looks like someone doesn't have enough volition, right, to get to work on time, when in reality they simply are very tired, or they forgot to set their alarm, or maybe they're just having enough cognitive difficulty that they just can't quite get it together in the morning. And so the solutions then, of course, I think, and again, to put my social worker hat on, one of the most important things is absolutely education. It's normalization. It's letting people know without a tone of pathologizing them that these things are quite normal, and that they happen, and that there's help out there for them, and that we understand. And the more that we kind of disseminate that information and we get it across to people, the more they're like, oh, maybe that's me, you know? And I like to tell people as when we're bringing people into the clinic, when we're doing patient recapture, which is something I'm really passionate about, is getting people back into the clinics, back into the VAs, getting them buy-in for their treatments, is to say, hey, we're here to help, and we're so happy to have you. And we have all these great things. We have music therapy, and we have art therapy, and we have yoga, and we have meditation. And we have these really great therapists who've been working with PTSD and TBI for 10, 15, 20 years. And we want you here, right? And yeah, I think that's probably the answer to that. I like to make it a TBI party, right? Like you're totally welcome, and we're thrilled to have you. Welcome to the family, right? That's the solution, honestly, is to let people know that they're welcome.
That's great, and I think trying to see what we can do about that type of perception in the civilian population as well. The types of resources that we have out for just anybody who's had a brain injury is sort of the goal as well. So we're a little over our time. I appreciate everybody sticking around here. So again, Kristen is going to go into a lot more detail next week, and I think the content is really, really going to be helpful. If you have questions about what you heard tonight, we will have this recorded so you can watch it again later. And also we'll have some follow-up emails with some of the stuff that I was talking about this at the beginning. But definitely come back next week so we can think about, you learned all this, now what are you going to do about it? What can we do, and what resources are out there for you? So with that, I'll say thank you again to Dr. Hayes for a great presentation. Thank you to Nikhil for the introduction at the front, and to all of you for spending the time with us. And we hope to see you next week. So have a great night.
Thank you all.